Okay, hello and welcome to part 2 of this series. In this video we're going to be creating the actual download limiting code, basically. So yeah, that's pretty much what we're going to do. So we're going to be starting with the download.php file, so let's just open that up and have a look at it. We're actually done with the file list now, but I'm going to keep it open in case I've made any mistakes and need to come back to it. Pessimistic like that. Anyway, so on the download.php file, the first thing we need to do is check a few error conditions. So the first thing we're going to check is to make sure they have actually specified a file and they haven't just browsed to download.php directly. So the way we're going to do that is by checking if the get variable file is empty or not. And if it is, we're going to show an error. In fact, we're not going to show an error, we're going to add to the errors array, which is what I always do. And then we're just going to say, I don't know, you must specify a file. And if they have specified a file, i.e. else, what we're going to do is add another check. So we can do else if something, and here we're going to check to make sure that the file actually exists in the folder, because if we try to download a file that doesn't exist, it's just going to throw loads of errors and look very ugly. So what we're going to do here is check to see if the file, as in get file, which is the file's name, exists in the files folder. So we're going to get a list of all of the files that actually are in that folder and then see if the get variable is one of those. We could use file exists, as in the file exists function, which PHP provides. However, if you put that would allow people to quite easily download files other than out of the files folder. So for example, if they were to enter something like that and then download.php, they'd actually be able to get the download.php script directly, which is something you don't really want, because, well, that'll be bad, because then they'll be able to see your code. Obviously, people seeing your code is never something you want, because it might contain things like database passwords or anything sensitive. So that's why we use this method of getting the list and then seeing if the file is one of them. There is a slight problem with this. If you have thousands and thousands of files in the folder, it's going to get quite slow. But assuming you've got just hundreds, you're going to be fine. Not going to be a noticeable performance difference. So what we're going to do is check to see if the file is in the array returned by the ScanDir function. So ScanDir returns a list of files in a folder, and we're going to use inArray to check if the given file is in that list. Make sense? Good. So what we can do is check if in array, and we're checking the file they provide, which is, with less typos, this, and we're checking it to see if it's in the array returned by ScanDir. And the folder we're scanning is the core path, which is defined in the init file. So core path /files, like so. Unlike the glob function, you don't need to do that. It's just the folder path. Okay, and that is pretty much that. However, obviously we don't want to check to see if it is found. We want to check to see if it's not found. So you can either do equals false, which is what I usually do, or if you prefer, you can put a exclamation mark before at the start of the condition, and that just means not, which is sort of the same as doing the equals false thing. I tend to do equals false, just because it's a bit more clear, but it's up to you. Anyway, what we're going to do here is just add something to the errors array, which is going to be, I don't know, file not found. Unhappy face. Oops. There. Obviously, only one of these entries will only ever be added to the array because we have if else if, but it makes sense to always use the same error checking method, the same code, less likely to get it wrong. And also, you might want to have more checks here. If you've got like a members system, you might want to make sure the user is logged in. Might want to make sure they've got a certain like privilege level or something like that. Anyway, once we've determined that, well, first let's display these errors. So we'll just we'll just check to see if the errors array is not empty. So if not empty, errors. I'm going to loop over the errors for each errors start again. As error. We're just going to do a simple echo, and we're going to stick each error inside a paragraph tag. There we go. No H. Right, good. And if it's not empty, no, wait, if it is empty, as in if it's not empty, which is this else block here, we're going to do the whole force download thingy. This is something I've covered before, but I'm going to go over it again just because it has been a while. So the first thing we need to do is work out the actual path to the file on the server. Essentially, that is this folder followed by this file name. So I'm going to define that in a variable because we're going to need to use it a couple of times. So let's do that. Let's call it let's create a new file, a new variable, and call it file path, and set this equal to this. So I'm just going to copy this down badly, and then after the files folder we want the file name. So I'm then going to copy this down into there and get rid of that comma. There we go. And then we want some information on the file, so we need a way to actually get this information. So what we're going to do is create a new function that returns this for a given file name. So I'm going to come above this function, and then I'm going to create a new function which is going to be called fetch file info. And this is going to take a variable which is going to be the file path. And actually we should really comment these functions. So what this one does is fetches info on all the files in the folder. Fodlers, right. I could not be more wrong. It doesn't really matter for a comment, but whatever. And this one fetches info on a specific file. Okay, so what we're going to do is basically copy this up here. So we're just going to go like this, copy, paste, and then instead of adding to this array, we're going to return this array. So replace that with that, and that's basically it. Now, because we've got this sort of function here that checks one file and returns information on it, there's no point duplicating the code down here. So what we can actually do is remove this and just use this function that we've defined. So we can remove that, and then we can use the function fetch file info of the file path, which is in this case just file. And that's exactly the same, except it adds an extra function call, but it means that if you ever want to change the information or change, I don't know, one of these functions, I don't know why you need to do that, but you might, then it only has to be done in one place. So yeah, seems like a fairly trivial thing at the moment because we've got like 22 lines of code, but if this was 1,000 or so line file, this sort of thing begins to matter. So yeah. Anyway, let's go back to our download page and actually use this function to, let me just check that. Yeah, I didn't think I put that bracket there, but I did. So now we can use this function to actually get the file information. So I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it file underscore info. This is going to be equal to the fetch file info function of the file path. And actually, well, I have made a mistake because these use file instead of file path. So there you go. I spotted before I tried it for once. Right, fixed. I haven't spotted whatever else I've done wrong. Anyway. Right, so now I've got the information, we can use this to send the various headers which are required to have the file downloaded. So the first one, there are 3 of these, 4, sorry. So I'm going to create 4 header lines, like so. First one is the content type, without the O in it, and this has to be set to application this stream octet, I guess, oct something. Second one is the content description, and this has to be set to file transfer, and that's the thing that makes the browser's download box pop up. Final thing, well no, not final thing, almost final thing. Next one is the content disposition. I think that's about right. It isn't. position. There we go. Attachment, and then one of those, semicolon, and the file name has to be specified here, and it's similar to a HTML property attribute type thing. And here we need to specify the file name, which comes from the file info function. So I'm going to add in a string here from the file info variable, like so. And the final one is the file size, which is the content length header. And again, this is from the file info function, and it's the size key. So that's our headers sent. What we need to do next is actually read out the file so that the browser gets the data. Because at the moment all we're doing is telling it that we're sending it a file, and then we're not actually sending it, which is rather rude. So what we're going to do is open the file using the fopen function. So this is kind of the sort of old PHP 4 method, but this is the way you need to do it if you want to only send a bit of the file at a time. So we'll use fopen on the file path, which will open the file as a file resource, and the file open mode is going to be RB, which means read binary. The B is only necessary if you're using Windows, but it doesn't do any harm to have it when you're using Linux, so just stick it in, why not? Yeah. So we need to define this as a variable so we can read from it. So what we're going to do is create a new variable called file and set it equal to this, like so. Then we're going to come down a few lines and we're going to loop until the end of the file. So we're going to create a while loop here, and we're going to do this while it's not the end of the file. So while not FEOF, file end of file, I guess that stands for. And we just pass in the file here. And then while that is true, as in while we're not at the end of the file, what we're going to do is read from the file using fread. This takes a parameter which is the file, and then the length that you want to read. So we're going to set this to 256, which is just, you know, a number of bytes. Could be anything, but 256 is a good number. And that will read the file, but then we need to echo it so that it's actually output to the browser instead of just being read into memory and then deleted. So that's that done. That would actually work now. But just for the sake of correctness, what we're going to do is close the file down here, which you just do using fclose, like so. So now we should be ready to give this a test. So let's go to our browser, and we'll hit reload, and nothing at all happened. Why did nothing at all happen? Okay, it apparently seemed to be some sort of dodgy network issue, but when I refresh the page with Control F5, it appears. So, yep, that worked. Twice. Anyway, let's go back to the code and give it a... Well, actually, let's download this file, which is stopped working again. Oh, come on. There we go. So let's just download this, and I'll get this window up so we can just test it properly. Right, so there we go. Looking at this, you can see that we get around 2, 3, 4, it should be about 4 meg of download speed. That's using my wireless, so not too terrible. And then what we need to do next is find a way to limit this. So this is finally the point of the whole tutorial. So let's just stop this download because we don't want to waste all my bandwidth, and let's go back to our code and think about a way to limit the speed. So what we want to do is essentially introduce a delay between each output of data. So sort of after we echo a little tiny chunk of the file, we're going to delay the script for a little while. So for example, if I did a sleep here, so if I slept the script, made it wait for 1 second, and we try and download the file again, you should see this is an awful lot slower. And it might not ever actually start downloading properly, because waiting for a whole second is a bit, you know, dodgy. Yeah, apparently that's not working. Nope. Nope. Okay, let's scrap that, and let's try waiting for a little bit longer. Anyway, you can't wait for a full second, because that's not, you know, that's too long. What you can do, though, is you use sleep, which is short for Microsleep, for a number of milliseconds. So if I do this for, say, 250 milliseconds, this should be a lot more noticeable, if it actually works, that is. There you go, that's started, and as you can see, it's an awful lot slower. It's actually 700 or so, and it's a fairly steady speed as well. So what's happening here is that the server is being forced to not respond with the file as quick as the user, me, this download box, can download it. So I mean, that's more or less it. Just make it wait a little bit. The problem is that if you send huge chunks of the file and then wait for a long time, you get sort of spikes, and you can actually see this if you open up the graph. So if I open up the download information graph, just click start again. You can actually see this if it ever produces a graph. There you go. Look, you get sort of these spikes that just go along. Oh, it seems to have flattened out. But if you had it sleep for a second or so, a long time, and then send like a meg of the file, it'd be 0, 0, 0, and then it'd spike and then 0 again, which is not a very sort of good way to do it, because you're going to get the same problem. The whole point of limiting the speed is so you avoid connection issues for people. But you can get the same problem because you can get people using up all the bandwidth very briefly, which is still not great. Anyway, that's enough about that. What we need to do next is just work out a way to make this a little bit more intuitive, because just 250 doesn't really bear any resemblance to the actual speed that's caused. So what we're going to do is just go above this file open here and create a new variable called delay, and this is going to be equal to a bit of maths, which is going to calculate how long we need to have the script wait for to get a specific speed. So what this is the amount of data read each read, so 256, divided by the speed you want. So say I want 600 kilobytes, multiplied by 1,000. And then you multiply by 1,000 just to convert it into milliseconds from seconds. So then down here, we're going to use sleep for delay. Okay, hit reload, not hit reload, hit go, and you should see that's about 600-ish. It's actually quite a lot off, but you can work the maths out properly if you want. So yeah, that is more or less that, and that's basically it. You're going to get slightly better results if you reduce the chunk size, but that will be a trade-off for like CPU use. It's up to you. Play around with it. I think that was pretty much everything I wanted to say. I think, yeah. So that is pretty much that. So as usual, hopefully you found this useful, and thank you for watching. Okay, so something I did sort of forget to mention, is hence why it's tagged on at the end like this, tacked on even, is that because the script is actually running until the file has finished downloading, you might get a few sort of timeout issues, because the default maximum execution time for a script on a web server is 30 seconds, I think. So if your file takes more than 30 seconds to download, which if you're limiting the speed is quite possible, you might want to set the maximum execution time up a little bit. And you can do that quite easily using the iniset function. So I'd recommend you do that just here. So you just do iniset max execution time equal to something big, or I think you can set it to 0, which disables it completely. Also spell execution, right? But yeah, that's pretty much that. So sorry for forgetting, and again, thank you for watching.